Chapter 1, Section 3, Part 1 of Capital Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Carl Manchester, 2007. Capital Volume 1 by Karl Marx. Section 3. The form of value or exchange value. Commodities come into the world in the shape of use values, articles or goods, such as iron, linen, corn, etc. This is their plain, homely, bodily form. They are, however, commodities only because they are something twofold, both objects of utility and, at the same time, depositories of value. They manifest themselves, therefore, as commodities, or have the form of commodities, only in so far as they have two forms, a physical or natural form, and a value form. The reality of the value of commodities differs in this respect from Dame Quickly, that we don't know, quote, where to have it, end quote. The value of commodities is the very opposite of the coarse materiality of their substance. Not an atom of matter enters into its composition. Turn and examine a single commodity by itself, as we will, yet in so far as it remains an object of value, it seems impossible to grasp it. If, however, we bear in mind that the value of commodities has a purely social reality, and that they acquire this reality only in so far as they are expressions or embodiments of one identical social substance, viz. Human labour, it follows as a matter of course that value can only manifest itself in a social relation of commodity to commodity. In fact, we started from exchange value, or the exchange relation of commodities, in order to get at the value that lies hidden behind it. We must now return to this form under which the value first appeared to us. Everyone knows, if he knows nothing else, that commodities have a value form common to them all, and presenting a marked contrast with the varied bodily forms of their use values. I mean their money form. Here, however, a test is set us, the performance of which has never yet been attempted by bourgeois economy. The task of tracing the genesis of this money form, of developing the expression of value implied in the value relation of commodities, from its simplest, almost imperceptible outline to the dazzling money form. By doing this, we shall at the same time solve the riddle presented by money. The simplest value relation is evidently that of one commodity to some one other commodity of a different kind. Hence the relation between the values of two commodities supplies us with the simplest expression of the value of a single commodity. A. Elementary or accidental form of value. X commodity A is worth Y commodity B. 20 yards of linen are worth one coat. 1. The two poles of the expression of value, relative form and equivalent form. The whole mystery of the form of value lies hidden in this elementary form. Its analysis, therefore, is our real difficulty. Here, two different kinds of commodities, in our example the linen and the coat, evidently play two different parts. The linen expresses its value in the coat. The coat serves as the material in which that value is expressed. The former plays an active, the latter a passive part. The value of the linen is represented as relative value, or appears in relative form. The coat officiates as equivalent, or appears in equivalent form. The relative form and the equivalent form are two intimately connected, mutually dependent and inseparable elements of the expression of value, but at the same time are mutually exclusive, antagonistic extremes, i.e. poles of the same expression. They are allotted respectively to the two different commodities brought into relation by that expression. It is not possible to express the value of linen in linen. 20 yards of linen equals 20 yards of linen is no expression of value. On the contrary, such an equation merely says that 20 yards of linen are nothing else than 20 yards of linen, a definite quantity of the use value linen. The value of the linen can therefore be expressed only relatively, i.e. in some other commodity. The relative form of the value of the linen presupposes, therefore, the presence of some other commodity, here the coat, under the form of an equivalent. On the other hand, the commodity that figures as the equivalent cannot at the same time assume the relative form. That second commodity is not the one whose value is expressed. Its function is merely to serve as the material in which the value of the first commodity is expressed. No doubt, the expression 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, or 20 yards of linen are worth 1 coat, implies the opposite relation. 1 coat equals 20 yards of linen, or 1 coat is worth 20 yards of linen. But in that case, I must reverse the equation in order to express the value of the coat relatively, and so soon as I do that, the linen becomes the equivalent instead of the coat. A single commodity cannot, therefore, simultaneously assume in the same expression of value both forms. The very polarity of these forms makes them mutually exclusive. Whether, then, a commodity assumes the relative form or the opposite equivalent form depends entirely upon its accidental position in the expression of value, that is, upon whether it is the commodity whose value is being expressed or the commodity in which value is being expressed. 2. The relative form of value. A. The nature and import of this form. In order to discover how the elementary expression of the value of a commodity lies hidden in the value relation of two commodities, we must, in the first place, consider the latter entirely apart from its quantitative aspect. The usual mode of procedure is generally the reverse, and in the value relation nothing is seen but the proportion between definite quantities of two different sorts of commodities that are considered equal to each other. It is apt to be forgotten that the magnitudes of different things can be compared quantitatively only when those magnitudes are expressed in terms of the same unit. It is only as expressions of such a unit that they are of the same denomination, and therefore commensurable. Footnote. The few economists, amongst whom is S. Bailey, who have occupied themselves with the analysis of the form of value, have been unable to arrive at any result, first because they confuse the form of value with value itself, and second because, under the coarse influence of the practical bourgeois, they exclusively give their attention to the quantitative aspects of the question. Quote, the command of quantity constitutes value. End quote. Money and its Vicissitudes, London 1837, by S. Bailey. End footnote. Whether 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, or equals 20 coats, or equals X coats, that is, whether a given quantity of linen is worth few or many coats, every such statement implies that the linen and coats, as magnitudes of value, are expressions of the same unit, things of the same kind. Linen equals coat is the basis of the equation. But the two commodities whose identity of quality is thus assumed do not play the same part. It is only the value of the linen that is expressed. And how? By its reference to the coat as its equivalent, as something that can be exchanged for it. In this relation, the coat is the mode of existence of value. Is value embodied? For only as such is it the same as the linen. On the other hand, the linen's own value comes to the front, receives independent expression, for it is only as being value that it is comparable with the coat as a thing of equal value, or exchangeable with the coat. To borrow an illustration from chemistry, butyric acid is a different substance from propylformate. Yet both are made up of the same chemical substances, carbon C, hydrogen H, and oxygen O, and that too in like proportions, namely C4H8O2. If we now equate butyric acid to propylformate, then, in the first place, propylformate would be, in this relation, merely a form of existence of C4H8O2, and in the second place, we should be stating that butyric acid also consists of C4H8O2. Therefore, by thus equating the two substances, expression would be given to their chemical composition, while their different physical forms would be neglected. If we say that, as values, commodities are mere congealations of human labour, we reduce them by our analysis, it is true, to the abstraction value, but we ascribe to this value no form apart from their bodily form. It is otherwise in the value relation of one commodity to another. Here the one stands forth in its character of value by reason of its relation to the other. By making the coat the equivalent of the linen, we equate the labour embodied in the former to that in the latter. Now, it is true that the tailoring which makes the coat is concrete labour of a different sort from the weaving which makes the linen, but the act of equating it to the weaving reduces the tailoring to that which is really equal in the two kinds of labour, to their common character of human labour. In this roundabout way, then, the fact is expressed that weaving also, in so far as it weaves value, has nothing to distinguish it from tailoring, and consequently is abstract human labour. It is the expression of equivalence between different sorts of commodities that alone brings into relief the specific character of value-creating labour, and this it does by actually reducing the different varieties of labour embodied in the different kinds of commodities to their common quality of human labour in the abstract. Footnote. The celebrated Franklin, one of the first economists after William Petty, who saw through the nature of value, says, quote, "Trade in general being nothing else but the exchange of labour for labour, the value of all things is most justly measured by labour." End quote. The Works of Franklin, etc., edited by Sparks, Boston, 1836, Volume 2. Franklin is unconscious that by estimating the value of everything in labour, he makes abstraction from any difference in the sorts of labour exchanged, and thus reduces them all to equal human labour. But although ignorant of this, yet he says it. He speaks first of quote, "the one labour," end quote, then of quote, "the other labour," end quote, and finally of quote, "labour," quote, without further qualification, as the substance of the value of everything. End footnote. There is, however, something else required beyond the expression of the specific character of the labour of which the value of the linen consists. Human labour power in motion, or human labour, creates value, but is not itself value. It becomes value only in its congealed state, when embodied in the form of some object. In order to express the value of the linen as a congelation of human labour, that value must be expressed as having objective existence, as being something materially different from the linen itself, and yet as something common to the linen and all other commodities. The problem is already solved. When occupying the position of equivalent in the equation of value, the coat ranks quantitatively as the equal of the linen, as something of the same kind, because it is value. In this position it is a thing in which we see nothing but value, or whose palpable bodily form represents value. Yet the coat itself, the body of the commodity, coat, is a mere use value. A coat as such no more tells us it is value than does the first piece of linen we take hold of. This shows that when placed in value relation to the linen, the coat signifies more than when out of that relation, just as many a man strutting about in a gorgeous uniform counts for no more than when in mufti. In the production of the coat, human labour power in the shape of tailoring must have been actually expended. Human labour is therefore accumulated in it. In this aspect the coat is a depository of value, but though worn to a thread, it does not let this fact show through. And as equivalent of the linen in the value equation, it exists under this aspect alone, counts therefore as embodied value, as a body that is value. A, for instance, cannot be your majesty to B, unless at the same time majesty in B's eyes assumes the bodily form of A, and what is more, with every new father of the people, changes its features, hair, and many other things besides. Hence, in the value equation, in which the coat is the equivalent of the linen, the coat officiates as the form of value. The value of the commodity linen is expressed by the bodily form of the commodity coat, the value of one by the use value of the other. As a use value, the linen is something palpably different from the coat. As value, it is the same as the coat, and now has the appearance of a coat. Thus the linen acquires a value form different from its physical form. The fact that it is value is made manifest by its equality with the coat, just as the sheep's nature of a Christian is shown in his resemblance to the Lamb of God. We see then All that our analysis of the value of commodities has already told us is told us by the linen itself, so soon as it comes into communication with another commodity, the coat. Only it betrays its thoughts in that language with which alone it is familiar, the language of commodities. In order to tell us that its own worth value is created by labour in its abstract character of human labour, it says that the coat, in so far as it is worth as much as the linen, and therefore is value, consists of the same labour as the linen. In order to inform us that its sublime reality as value is not the same as its buckram body, it says that the value has the appearance of a coat, and consequently that so far as the linen is value, it and the coat are as like as two peas. We may here remark that the language of commodities has, besides Hebrew, many more or less correct dialects. The German Verstehen, to be worth, for instance, expresses in a less striking manner than the Romance verbs valere, valer, valoir, that the equating of commodity B to commodity A is commodity A's own mode of expressing its value. Paris vaut bien une messe. By means, therefore, of the value relation expressed in our equation, the bodily form of commodity B becomes the value form of commodity A, or the body of commodity B acts as a mirror to the value of commodity A. Footnote: in a sort of way, it is with man as with commodities. Since he comes into the world neither with a looking glass in his hand, nor as a Fictinian philosopher to whom I am I is sufficient, man first seeks and recognizes himself in other men. Peter only establishes his own identity as a man by first comparing himself with Paul as being of like kind, and thereby Paul, just as he stands in his Pauline personality, becomes to Peter the type of the genus Homo. End footnote. By putting itself in relation with commodity B as value in propriâ persona, as the matter of which human labour is made up, the commodity A converts the value in use, B, into the substance in which to express its, A's, own value. The value of A, thus expressed in the use value of B, has taken the form of relative value. B. Quantitative determination of relative value. Every commodity whose value it is intended to express is a useful object of given quantity, as 15 bushels of corn or 100 pounds of coffee, and a given quantity of any commodity contains a definite quantity of human labour. The value form must therefore not only express value generally, but also value in definite quantity. Therefore, in the value relation of commodity A to commodity B, of the linen to the coat, not only is the latter, as value in general, made the equal in quality of the linen, but a definite quantity of coat, one coat, is made the equivalent of a definite quantity, 20 yards, of linen. The equation 20 yards of linen equals one coat, or 20 yards of linen are worth one coat, implies that the same quantity of value substance, congealed labour, is embodied in both, that the two commodities have each cost the same amount of labour of the same quantity of labour time. But the labour time necessary for the production of 20 yards of linen or one coat varies with every change in the productiveness of weaving or tailoring. We have now to consider the influence of such changes on the quantitative aspect of the relative expression of value. 1. Let the value of the linen vary, that of the coat remaining constant. Footnote. Value is here, as occasionally in the preceding pages, used in the sense of value determined as to quantity, or of magnitude of value. End footnote. If, say, in consequence of the exhaustion of flax-growing soil, the labour time necessary for the production of the linen be doubled, the value of the linen will also be doubled. Instead of the equation 20 yards of linen equals one coat, we should have 20 yards of linen equals two coats, since one coat would now contain only half the labour time embodied in 20 yards of linen. If, on the other hand, in consequence, say, of improved looms, this labour time be reduced by one half, the value of the linen would fall by one half. Consequently, we should have 20 yards of linen equals half a coat. The relative value of commodity A, i.e. its value expressed in commodity B, rises and falls directly as the value of A, the value of B being supposed constant. 2. Let the value of the linen remain constant, while the value of the coat varies. If, under these circumstances, in consequence, for instance, of a poor crop of wool, the labour time necessary for the production of a coat becomes doubled, we have, instead of 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, 20 yards of linen equals half a coat. If, on the other hand, the value of the coat sinks by 1/2, then 20 yards of linen equals 2 coats. Hence, if the value of commodity A remain constant, its relative value expressed in commodity B rises and falls inversely as the value of B. If we compare the different cases in 1 and 2, we see that the same change of magnitude in relative value may arise from totally opposite causes. Thus the equation 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat becomes 20 yards of linen equals 2 coats, either because the value of the linen has doubled or because the value of the coat has fallen by 1/2. And it becomes 20 yards of linen equals half a coat, either because the value of the linen has fallen by 1/2 or because the value of the coat has doubled. 3. Let the quantities of labour time respectively necessary for the production of the linen and the coat vary simultaneously in the same direction and in the same proportion. In this case, 20 yards of linen continue to equal 1 coat, however much their values have altered. Their change of value is seen as soon as they are compared with the third commodity, whose value has remained constant. If the values of all commodities rose and fell simultaneously and in the same proportion, their relative values would remain unaltered. Their real change of value would appear from the diminished or increased quantity of commodities produced in a given time. 4. The labour time respectively necessary for the production of the linen and the coat, and therefore the value of these commodities, may simultaneously vary in the same direction, but at unequal rates or in opposite directions or in other ways. The effect of all these possible different variations on the relative value of a commodity may be deduced from the results of 1, 2 and 3. Thus real changes in the magnitude of value are neither unequivocally nor exhaustively reflected in their relative expression, that is, in the equation expressing the magnitude of relative value. The relative value of a commodity may vary, although its value remains constant. Its relative value may remain constant, although its value varies. And finally, simultaneous variations in the magnitude of value and in that of its relative expression by no means necessarily correspond in amount. Footnote. This incongruity between the magnitude of value and its relative expression has, with customary ingenuity, been exploited by vulgar economists. For example, quote, "Once admit that A falls because B, with which it is exchanged, rises while no less labour is bestowed in the meantime on A, and your general principle of value falls to the ground. If he, Ricardo, allowed that when A rises in value relatively to B, B falls in value relatively to A, he cut away the ground on which he rested his grand proposition, that the value of a commodity is ever determined by the labour embodied in it. For if a change in the cost of A alters not only its own value in relation to B for which it is exchanged, but also the value of B relatively to that of A, though no change has taken place in the quantity of labour to produce B, then not only the doctrine falls to the ground, which asserts that the quantity of labour bestowed on an article regulates its value, but also that which affirms the cost of an article to regulate its value." End quote. J. Broadhurst, Political Economy, London, 1842. Mr. Broadhurst might just as well say, consider the fractions 10/20, 10/50, 10/100, etc. The number 10 remains unchanged, and yet its proportional magnitude, its magnitude relatively to the numbers 20, 50, 100, etc., continually diminishes. Therefore, the great principle that the magnitude of a whole number, such as 10, is regulated by the number of times unity is contained in it, falls to the ground. Editorial note. The author explains in section 4 of this chapter what he understands by vulgar economy. Engels. End editorial note. End footnote. 3. The equivalent form of value. We have seen that commodity A, the linen, by expressing its value in the use value of a commodity differing in kind, the coat, at the same time impresses upon the latter a specific form of value, namely that of the equivalent. The commodity linen manifests its quality of having a value by the fact that the coat, without having assumed a value form different from its bodily form, is equated to the linen. The fact that the latter therefore has a value is expressed by saying that the coat is directly exchangeable with it. Therefore, when we say that the commodity is in the equivalent form, we express the fact that it is directly exchangeable with other commodities. When one commodity, such as a coat, serves as the equivalent of another, such as linen, and coats consequently acquire the characteristic property of being directly exchangeable with linen, we are far from knowing in what proportion the two are exchangeable. The value of the linen being given in magnitude, the proportion depends on the value of the coat. Whether the coat serves as the equivalent and the linen as relative value, or the linen as the equivalent of the coat as relative value, the magnitude of the coat's value is determined independently of its value form by the labour time necessary for its production. But whenever the coat assumes in the equation of value the position of equivalent, its value acquires no quantitative expression. On the contrary, the commodity coat now figures only as a definite quantity of some article. For instance, 40 yards of linen are worth what? 2 coats. Because the commodity coat here plays the part of equivalent, because the use value of coat, as opposed to the linen, figures as an embodiment of value. Therefore, a definite number of coats suffices to express the definite quantity of value in the linen. 2 coats may therefore express the quantity of value of 40 yards of linen, but they can never express the quantity of their own value. A superficial observation of this fact, namely that in the question of value the equivalent figures exclusively as a simple quantity of some article of some use value, has misled Bailey, as also many others, both before and after him, into seeing in the expression of value merely a quantitative relation, the truth being that when a commodity acts as equivalent, no quantitative determination of its value is expressed. The first peculiarity that strikes us in considering the form of the equivalent is this: use value becomes the form of manifestation, the phenomenal form of its opposite, value. The bodily form of the commodity becomes its value form, but mark well that this quid pro quo exists in the case of any commodity B, only when some other commodity A enters into a value relation with it, and then only within the limits of this relation. Since no commodity can stand in the relation of equivalent to itself, and thus turn its own bodily shape into the expression of its own value, every commodity is compelled to choose some other commodity for its equivalent, and to accept the use value, that is to say, the bodily shape of that other commodity, as the form of its own value. One of the measures that we apply to commodities as material substances, as use values, will serve to illustrate this point. A sugar loaf, being a body, is heavy, and therefore has weight. But we can neither see nor touch this weight. We then take various pieces of iron whose weight has been determined beforehand. The iron, as iron, is no more the form of manifestation of weight than is the sugar loaf. Nevertheless, in order to express the sugar loaf as so much weight, we put it into a weight relation with the iron. In this relation, the iron officiates as a body representing nothing but weight. A certain quantity of iron therefore serves as the measure of the weight of the sugar, and represents in relation to the sugar loaf, weight embodied, the form of manifestation of weight. This part is played by the iron only within this relation, into which the sugar or any other body whose weight has to be determined enters with the iron. Were they not both heavy, they could not enter into this relation, and the one could therefore not serve as the expression of the weight of the other. When we throw both into the scales, we see in reality that as weight they are both the same, and that therefore, when taken in proper proportions, they have the same weight. Just as the substance iron, as a measure of weight, represents in relation to the sugar loaf weight alone, so in our expression of value, the material object, coat, in relation to the linen, represents value alone. Here, however, the analogy ceases. The iron in the expression of weight of the sugar loaf represents a natural property common to both bodies, namely their weight, but the coat in the expression of value of the linen represents a non-natural property of both, something purely social, namely their value. Since the relative form of value of a commodity, the linen, for example, expresses the value of that commodity as being something wholly different from its substance and properties, as being, for instance, coat-like, we see that this expression itself indicates that some social relation lies at the bottom of it. With the equivalent form, it is just the contrary. The very essence of this form is that the material commodity itself, the coat, just as it is, expresses value, and is endowed with the form of value by nature itself. Of course, this holds good only so long as the value relation exists in which the coat stands in the position of equivalent to the linen. Footnote. Such expressions of relations in general, called by Hegel reflex categories, form a very curious class. For instance, one man is king only because other men stand in the relation of subjects to him. They, on the contrary, imagine that they are subjects because he is king. End footnote. Since, however, the properties of a thing are not the result of its relations to other things, but only manifest themselves in such relations, the coat seems to be endowed with its equivalent form, its property of being directly exchangeable, just as much by nature as it is endowed with the property of being heavy, or the capacity to keep us warm. Hence the enigmatical character of the equivalent form, which escapes the notice of the bourgeois political economist until this form, completely developed, confronts him in the shape of money. He then seeks to explain away the mystical character of gold and silver by substituting for them less dazzling commodities and by reciting with ever renewed satisfaction the catalogue of all possible commodities which at one time or another have played the part of equivalent. He has not the least suspicion that the most simple expression of value, such as 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, already propounds the riddle of the equivalent form for our solution. The body of the commodity that serves as the equivalent figures as the materialization of human labour in the abstract, and is at the same time the product of some specifically useful concrete labour. This concrete labour becomes, therefore, the medium for expressing abstract human labour. If, on the one hand, the coat ranks as nothing but the embodiment of abstract human labour, so, on the other hand, the tailoring which is actually embodied in it counts as nothing but the form under which that abstract labour is realised. In the expression of value of the linen, the utility of the tailoring consists not in making clothes, but in making an object, which we at once recognise to be value, and therefore to be a congelation of labour, but of labour indistinguishable from that realised in the value of the linen. In order to act as such a mirror of value, the labour of tailoring must reflect nothing besides its own abstract quality of being human labour generally. In tailoring, as well as in weaving, human labour power is expended. Both, therefore, possess the general property of being human labour, and may therefore, in certain cases, such as in the production of value, have to be considered under this aspect alone. There is nothing mysterious in this, but in the expression of value there is a complete turn of the tables. For instance, how is the fact to be expressed that weaving creates the value of the linen not by virtue of being weaving as such, but by reason of its general property of being human labour? Simply by opposing to weaving that other particular form of concrete labour, in this instance tailoring, which produces the equivalent of the product of weaving. Just as the coat in its bodily form became a direct expression of value, so now does tailoring, a concrete form of labour, appear as the direct and palpable embodiment of human labour generally. Hence, the second peculiarity of the equivalent form is that concrete labour becomes the form under which its opposite, abstract human labour, manifests itself. But because this concrete labour, tailoring in our case, ranks as and is directly identified with undifferentiated human labour, it also ranks as identical with any other sort of labour, and therefore with that embodied in the linen. Consequently, although, like all other commodity-producing labour, it is the labour of private individuals, yet at the same time it ranks as labour directly social in its character. This is the reason why it results in a product directly exchangeable with other commodities. We have then a third peculiarity of the equivalent form, namely, that the labour of private individuals takes the form of its opposite, labour directly social in its form. The two latter peculiarities of the equivalent form will become more intelligible if we go back to the great thinker who was the first to analyse so many forms, whether of thought, society, or nature, and amongst them also the form of value. I mean Aristotle. In the first place, he clearly enunciates that the money form of commodities is only the further development of the simple form of value, i.e. of the expression of the value of one commodity in some other commodity, taken at random, for he says 5 beds equals 1 house is not to be distinguished from 5 beds equals so much money. He further sees that the value relation which gives rise to this expression makes it necessary that the house should qualitatively be made the equal of the bed, and that without such an equalization these two clearly different things could not be compared with each other as commensurable quantities. Exchange, he says, cannot take place without equality, and equality not without commensurability. Here, however, he comes to a stop and gives up the further analysis of the form of value. Quote, "It is, however, in reality impossible that such unlike things can be commensurable," end quote, i.e. qualitatively equal. Such an equalization can only be something foreign to their real nature, consequently only quote, "a makeshift for practical purposes," end quote. Aristotle therefore himself tells us what barred the way to his further analysis. It was the absence of any concept of value. What is that equal something, that common substance, which admits of the value of the beds being expressed by a house? Such a thing in truth cannot exist, says Aristotle. And why not? Compared with the beds, the house does represent something equal to them, insofar as it represents what is really equal, both in the beds and the house, and that is human labour. There was, however, an important fact which prevented Aristotle from seeing that to attribute value to commodities is merely a mode of expressing all labour as equal human labour, and consequently as labour of equal quality. Greek society was founded upon slavery, and had therefore for its natural basis the inequality of men and their labour powers. The secret of the expression of value, namely, that all kinds of labour are equal and equivalent, because and so far as they are human labour in general, cannot be deciphered until the notion of human equality has already acquired the fixity of a popular prejudice. This, however, is possible only in a society in which the great mass of the produce of labour takes the form of commodities, in which, consequently, the dominant relation between man and man is that of owners of commodities. The brilliancy of Aristotle's genius is shown by this alone, that he discovered in the expression of the value of commodities a relation of equality. The peculiar conditions of the society in which he lived alone prevented him from discovering what, in truth, was at the bottom of this equality. 4. The elementary form of value considered as a whole. The elementary form of value of a commodity is contained in the equation expressing its value relation to another commodity of a different kind, or in its exchange relation to the same. The value of commodity A is qualitatively expressed by the fact that commodity B is directly exchangeable with it. Its value is quantitatively expressed by the fact that a definite quantity of B is exchangeable with a definite quantity of A. In other words, the value of a commodity obtains independent and definite expression by taking the form of exchange value. When at the beginning of this chapter we said in common parlance that a commodity is both a use value and an exchange value, we were, accurately speaking, wrong. A commodity is a use value or object of utility, and a value. It manifests itself as this twofold thing that it is, as soon as its value assumes an independent form, viz. The form of exchange value. It never assumes this form when isolated, but only when placed in a value or exchange relation with another commodity of a different kind. When once we know this, such a mode of expression does no harm, it simply serves as an abbreviation. Our analysis has shown that the form or expression of the value of a commodity originates in the nature of value, and not that value and its magnitude originate in the mode of their expression as exchange value. This, however, is the delusion as well of the mercantilists and their recent revivers, Ferrier, Ganil, and others, as also of their antipodes, the modern bagmen of free trade, such as Bastiat. Footnote: F.L.A. Ferrier, sous-inspecteur des douanes du gouvernement considéré dans ses rapports avec le commerce, Paris 1805, and Charles Ganil, Des systèmes d'économie politique, 2nd edition, Paris 1821. End footnote. The mercantilists lay special stress on the qualitative aspect of the expression of value, and consequently on the equivalent form of commodities, which attains its full perfection in money. The modern hawkers of free trade, who must get rid of their article at any price, on the other hand, lay most stress on the quantitative aspect of the relative form of value. For them there consequently exists neither value nor magnitude of value anywhere except in its expression by means of the exchange relation of commodities, that is, in the daily list of prices current. MacLeod, who has taken upon himself to dress up the confused ideas of Lombard Street in the most learned finery, is a successful cross between the superstitious mercantilists and the enlightened free trade bagmen. A close scrutiny of the expression of the value of A in terms of B, contained in the equation expressing the value relation of A to B, has shown us that, within that relation, the bodily form of A figures only as a use value, the bodily form of B only as the form or aspect of value. The opposition or contrast existing internally in each commodity between use value and value is, therefore, made evident externally by two commodities being placed in such relation to each other that the commodity whose value it is sought to express figures directly as a mere use value, while the commodity in which that value is to be expressed figures directly as a mere exchange value. Hence the elementary form of value of a commodity is the elementary form in which the contrast contained in that commodity between use value and value becomes apparent. Every product of labour is, in all states of society, a use value, but it is only at a definite historical epoch in a society's development that such a product becomes a commodity, viz., at the epoch when the labour spent on the production of a useful article becomes expressed as one of the objective qualities of that article, i.e. as its value. It therefore follows that the elementary value form is also the primitive form under which a product of labour appears historically as a commodity, and that the gradual transformation of such products into commodities proceeds pari passu with the development of the value form. We perceive at first sight the deficiencies of the elementary form of value. It is a mere germ, which must undergo a series of metamorphoses before it can ripen into the price form. The expression of the value commodity A in terms of any other commodity B merely distinguishes the value from the use value of A, and therefore places A merely in a relation of exchange with a single different commodity, B. But it is still far from expressing A's qualitative equality and quantitative proportionality to all commodities. To the elementary relative value form of a commodity there corresponds the single equivalent form of one other commodity. Thus, in the relative expression of value of the linen, the coat assumes the form of equivalent, or of being directly exchangeable, only in relation to a single commodity, the linen. Nevertheless, the elementary form of value passes, by an easy transition, into a more complete form. It is true that by means of the elementary form, the value of a commodity A becomes expressed in terms of one and only one other commodity. But that one may be a commodity of any kind, coat, iron, corn, or anything else. Therefore, according as A is placed in relation with one or the other, we get from one and the same commodity different elementary expressions of value. Footnote: in Homer, for instance, the value of an article is expressed in a series of different things. End footnote. The number of such possible expressions is limited only by the number of different kinds of commodities distinct from it. The isolated expression of a's value is therefore convertible into a series, prolonged to any length, of the different elementary expressions of that value. End of chapter 1, section 3, part 1.